What I was thinking about, it's kind of hard because it's a big area, but it's an area that you cover sometimes in your podcasts, and it's an area that I think is interesting, and you covered it especially in the David Icke podcast, or at least for about 10 or 15 minutes. It's about the difference between this idea of consciousness and knowledge. Okay, so it's a big area. As you were saying, a lot of the New Age thing is this idea of I am consciousness, which I think comes from the Vedic thing of, Tattvam Asi, I am that. And so people who have these extraordinary experiences like David Icke was speaking about that happened to him on that mountain, they get this feeling that they have had some sort of an enlightenment experience. And so they begin to talk about consciousness as if they understand it. I actually wonder if sometimes it's a little bit to do with difference of interpretation of words, because what you were actually saying is that consciousness is the mediation between the senses and the mind. So it's the subject-object relationship. So it's all to do with the mind and the mental processes, whereas their idea of what they seem to be using the word consciousness for is more like God or all spirit or divinity or something like this. But a lot of people seem to think that they then become God, or so I just think it's very common, this idea that
yes, it is. Yeah, it's very prevalent. But the thing is, to answer your question, I'll try to skip philosophical nitpicking. This idea or this term consciousness that is used in New Age is in fact, let's say, ersatz or surrogate idea of spirit for modern age. It is materialization of something that is not material, although they will say that it is not material, but then they will proceed to say it's more subtle than matter, and then they start to talk about some kind of strings or spiritual atoms.
Vibration is the
Vibrations, exactly. That's a clear sign. I mean, there is nothing. How should I put it? There is nothing further to look into when you hear this, because, for instance, take any medieval mystic on top of my head. I don't know, Eckhart or somebody, and they love Eckhart, interestingly enough, a man who was considered and still is considered on the border of heresy in Christianity. That's arguable, but let's take him, for example. You will never read, as far as I know, that he talks about Bewusstsein, consciousness. I mean, it's a 13th to 14th century German, but no correlate when he describes, let's say, mystical state. He doesn't understand it as experience. He understands it as a state. This is not nitpicking, because in this stage of transcending, let's say, these limitations of everyday, as Christian would say, fallen state that are given like a gift from on high, quote unquote. There is never talk about experience, because it excludes this separateness that exists in every experience. When you have an experience, as David Icke, he's brilliant because he's so pronouncing these things. He's underlying always consciousness having an experience, but having an experience requires two. It requires experience and experienced. For instance, in mysticism, this line tends to get progressively blurred. I wouldn't go too much into talking about mysticism because people talk about it very offhandedly. This is a very deep and high, let's say, achievement, with some reservations, that nobody knows much about except those having it and the one giving it to them. So I don't like to theorize too much and intellectualize it, but it is clearly, even the opposite of what those New Agers are telling. And now a lot of people, I think, have a right, let's say, intuition of what something like this would be, or what some deeper or higher emotion or concept would be, and then cloak it in the wrong term. But those who wrote books, those who created those intellectual movements like New Age, didn't create them for the right reason. They created them for philosophical reasons out of their understanding of the world and themselves. And this understanding is the opposite, is a polar opposite of everything they claim they provide. I don't know about Indian tradition or let's say Far Eastern tradition, but I don't think anything corresponding to New Age exists in it.
It's sort of related in a way to Vedic teaching in that they have a differentiation in different parts of the mind. So you have right thought, wrong thought, imagination, sleep, and memory. Okay, so that's what they say is the, structure of thought. So I think it's interesting because as far as I can make out, a lot of this consciousness talk and I am consciousness and this new agey kind of feelings and emotions that goes on is actually about imagination. It's about the use of imagination and what in the Vedic system they call fancy or really fantasy. But fantasy is very strong, and it seems to me that the fantasy element in people's minds has been kind of drawn together to create this idea, and that's why so many people find it so beguiling to go towards these movements, because it's so uplifting to imagine crazy things and to have shared fantasy, really, is what I think it is. Like what struck me when I was listening to David Icke is that some of it is it's just fantasy, the experience.
I think you picked the right word, fantasy, imagination. I think that's the key. I don't know, Mihai, what would you make of it?
Well, regarding this new age topic, I think a friend of mine described it summarized it very neatly. We were talking about some young kids he knew that were taking drugs, to have these trips and to get out of the ordinary. And he told me some guys who are into this new age stuff told him that, instead of taking drugs, I prefer to do meditation and reach the same states or the same experiences. So that about summarizes it, how profound this thing is, how profound this meditation is. If it takes you no further than what some drugs can give you. And I'm not saying that all the drugs necessarily just give an illusory state of the brain, but they do not go any deeper than the psychic domain, and a lot of it is very, very toxic. You wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. Now, from the perspective of Orthodox ascetical tradition, fantasy, this faculty of imagination is the main gateway through which the passions, let's say, enter the soul, and the main gateway through which demonic forces act upon the soul. So I wouldn't recommend anyone to engage in fantasy too much.
And yet, fantasy and imagination is the quality of mind that is most stimulated in modern times. For example, memory.
Yes.
Memory is not very important anymore.
No, it's not.
But projecting and imagining, like sometimes I even find when I'm falling asleep that the visuals that emerge are so trippy that it has got to be coming from the external environment.
This is because in the modern world, everything has become extremely visual. So we are accustomed, especially someone like me who lives in a big city, you have all sorts of excitory, or how would you say, images that excite the senses, in a violent way. So you have billboards, you have all sorts of commercials, you have TV screens almost everywhere, including metro stations. Of course, this without saying anything of what goes on TV or on the internet. So yes, we have lost certain capacities of the mind, while exacerbating or hypertrophying some others, like this imagination. So we have lost, like you said, the ability of memory. The ability of memory is very rare these days, and not only memory as a cerebral act, but also memory as like life used to be a little bit different just 5 or 10 years ago. People are, especially the younger generations, are acting more and more as like the world always existed as it does at this moment. So their memory, so to speak, doesn't extend too much in the past.
It's a constant nowness. But even in New Age terms, the constant nowness is the promoted state, the state of now. Yeah, that was just an area that I just wanted to cover because I think it's really interesting. I find a lot of people that I have met over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, especially online, that I thought I was sharing in terms of spiritual interests with, seemed to have much more of an interest in fantastic states or fantasy states. And the fact is that it's often very mundane, very boring,
I have this sensation, sorry for interrupting, that some people, who are getting into Orthodox Christianity, especially from the West these days, some of them, come through the route of Dionysius the Areopagite and other fathers who are, let's say, the mystical fathers. And they sort of have this idea, just like the one you described it, of the possibility of getting a fantastic experience really fast. Many of them can be quite disappointed after a while, especially if there is nothing real, that conversion, if there is no genuine movement towards real spirituality. It gets pretty disappointing really fast because you realize that your day-to-day experience is quite far away from those lofty mystical states that you imagine you will inhabit very soon.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of relates as well to that article that you shared, Branko. Do you remember from the Arcane Knowledge website by that man Daniel
Castellano?
Yeah. And he was writing about the dark night of the soul from the point of view of St. John of the Cross, I think. And he was talking about what he calls imaginative meditation. And then what happens in the beginning is that a lot of people use imaginative meditation because it's very hard to go beyond it.
Yeah.
And then what happens is maybe people have experiences like you've just mentioned, Mihai, very fast experiences. But then there's this aridity or spiritual desert where nothing happens and you have to move beyond fantasy.
This actually happens, I think, in all areas of life. When you take up to learning something new, like a foreign language or something like this, you may be very enthusiastic, especially to have some favorite authors that you're gonna read in their native language and so on. But the initial enthusiasm is very quickly replaced by the realization that the road to actually, achieving great results in that language is a little bit harder, you'd have expected. So everything that is valuable in life takes effort and also takes courage. You have to go beyond your own limitations, your own love for comfort or for easy results.
As concerns St. John of the Cross, that book was written as a manual for monks. And this is very important because the states in which they were going in were the states on the road of uncompromising faith. They were priests. It was not meant for laymen, I think. The reason being is that this dark night of the soul has a very precise meaning. This is the act of God that means deliberate act of depraving the contemplative or the faithful from all the delights that prayer yields. So it's not a loss of faith. This is very important, and this is what's wrong with modern understanding of these things. When people hear about Dark Night of the Soul, they think Kierkegaard, or they think somebody losing his faith and then finding it. It's got nothing to do with that. The thing is that faith is present. Faith is never put in question, because faith is not simply a belief. It is the ability to intend towards invisible, and has among other things, a very rational aspect. It is to an extent a deliberate act, and it is not belief in the sense somebody told me something and I believe it without evidence. This has nothing to do with it, because faith is necessary. Because you are trying to see what you cannot see with senses, and what you cannot infer even with your intellect. You can approach it to some level, but there is a level that you will never be able to cross, and therefore you need a stance or disposition that opens you towards being enlightened or infused, or there are a few terms to explain that, with something that is above you. And the dark night is when this pleasing aspect, comforting aspect, or liberating aspect is denied to you. And this is, in fact, the purpose is purification. So this is also one difference that people, it does tie into this subject of these new kinds of so-called spiritualities. They miss those very important details, and devil is in details, and apparently God is also. So when you miss, this is why I am prone to nitpicking about words, because I notice that people can get very advanced intellectually in a, let's say, a rather mundane notion of intellect, where they really learn a lot theoretically, or better to say, in the sense of collating a lot of informations about let's say some of these doctrines. But this is all they have. Their attitudes remain the same. They are not changed inside. And then they take notions as this dark night or mysticism in general and completely distort them, because they reformulate them in order to fit their needs. And this is very wrong thing to do.
It seems to me that dark night is often used as a very emotional term to cover emotional states.
I think it's a state of seeing the world without God. I think that's how I see it. But it is provided by God, and the one who is having it knows this. It's not losing the faith. I think John even says that at few points. It's when God hides from me or withdraws. He won't say face, but he says hand from me, and I don't see him anywhere. I can't find him anywhere anymore. And then he says, I remember that he gave a practical advice. Then try to seek him when you saw him last time. Get back inwardly to that position. So it is emotional, but I think those emotions are not really ordinary emotions.
No, I didn't actually mean that it actually theologically or whatever philosophically relates to an emotional state. I have seen the idea of the dark night of the soul used regularly among people who are definitely not having any dark night of the soul experience. They're just having a bad time emotionally, or life is a bit crap at the moment or whatever. Mm-hmm. And what I'm actually saying is that there's a kind of a romanticism about this dark night of the soul, like as if it's some sort of romantic gothic state.
Well, I think this applies also to a more mundane concept, depression. People say we are depressed. Depression is a clinical state. It's a horrible state. It has organic basis. This is something completely different. When you fall into depression, you cannot pull yourself out of it by your hair like Baron Munchausen. A dark night of the soul could be described, I'd say, as something analogous in a strained analogy, because I think the sentiments one gets in that state are very subtle and are not sentiments everybody has on conscious level, because those are sentiments of somebody who is very advanced in this monastic life. And this is a very special way of life. Some things happen to those people if they are really in it, that people in everyday life rarely or never really experience. So I think those are that's a very strict technical concept. It's not concept. It's John of the Cross was a poet. He was a kind of mystic that had this very strong, let's say, I don't know, so freedom of imagination and sentiment. You have mystics who are more strict, but it is a technical concept nonetheless, and it was meant for Carmelite monks of Spain. I mean, not that it is not applicable, but it is monastic. It is written for monastic people leading a monastic life. And for instance, Carmelite nuns, at least some of them, live in complete closure. It's a very strict order. So this is where this concept comes into play. I think closest analogy would be depression, because depression is also something you can do nothing about. And the things, those moods, not emotions, I would call them moods, because mood implies a kind of all-encompassing understanding. I have a mood of melancholy, and I see everything through melancholy. Well, for instance, this mood of complete abandon by God, while still keeping this state of faith, is also something that you cannot control, because its cause is in you, not in the sense that you are causing it, but in the sense that God is closer to you than your own soul. Believe it or not, because in this hierarchical understanding, I think it was Eckhart, I'll try to paraphrase him how he said it, the soul is closer to me than I don't know, than my hand. But God is even closer to me than is my heart. It's a little hard to comprehend, but this is affirmation of absolute or complete state of unbroken union that God's creature always holds with him. And this union is manifested inside of you, not outside of you. So if, to put it in more mundane terms, if your Lord and Master is pissed off and wants to say, of course, in inverted commas, and wants to give you a bit of beating to teach you something, there is nothing in this world that can keep you from receiving this beating. If I see something scary, I can close my eyes. If you are running into accident with your car and you know you're going to die, but you can still put your hands over your eyes, at least do something. About this, you can do nothing, and this just shows you, this kind of like teaches man that he's in completely dependent on God in everything, and this is the way of mystic, and somebody who was called to be a monk and really properly does what monks do, that is to say, pray and don't involve in something else, he is more likely to have this happen to him than we who live always with this active illusion that we are creators of our own being. I think this is something that this is illusion that is inborn. You can only chip at it piece by piece. You cannot just throw it away. Like New Agers say, I'm throwing away my ego and now I'll be good. They don't know what it means to lose an ego. To lose an ego means to lose your life's history, to lose most of the things you hold dear, because they are all connected to what you understand as I. And this is, in fact, the definition of dying for most people, because most of us, we understand ourselves through the answer to a question, who am I? And ego is this I. And consciousness is not this I. Consciousness is the projection of it. So consciousness is something even weaker. And now you want to, you read some kind of pop new age guru, and you decide you're gonna drop this all on a queue. No, you won't. This is, I think, because this is tantamount to death. This is what most people intuit as death. Me not existing anymore. Death is more than this, of course, but not a lot of us is aware of that, and not a lot of us are prepared to assimilate this truth. So.
In a way, like then the idea that I am consciousness that we were talking about right at the beginning, where David Icke was experiencing that I am consciousness, is actually the ultimate like ego state.
I would say yes. I think this is, the trouble is, and now I have to bring up some philosophy into this, because philosophy in modern age, I would say, is the expression of historical self-understanding of mostly European peoples. Philosophy used to be something different before. Let's say, for the sake of argument, before Descartes and this birth of modern era. And this philosophy is mostly philosophy of consciousness, whether it be Marxism, which was explicitly in early phases philosophy, German. It was built on German idealism, which is philosophy of consciousness and the philosophy of I. And the fact that philosophy, modern philosophy is like that, is a reflection, in my opinion, of the state of human self-understanding today. People understand themselves in this way. Of course, it's not absolute. There are always differences, but the ideology, let's say, ruling ideology, is this. And ego and consciousness are closely related because ego has to perceive itself, has to put something opposite of itself. It cannot just reflect into itself. Very simple example is the use of the mirror. This is it. You have to have mirror to see yourself. There is a way to see yourself without mediation, but this is already going out of the ego territory, because ego is a kind of like point. We can imagine it like that, as a point of reference that is a center of this relationship between it and the world. There is I and there is not I. And this not I need in order to say I. There must be something opposite from me. There must be something completely different than me. And a consciousness is ego trying to cope with this non-I. Consciousness is the reflection, like looking into mirror. In order to say that's me, if I get real pissed drunk, I have to take out my ID and read my name. I know people who really had to do this, but it's fine. I mean, it's ridiculous, but this is, you have to have some kind of identity. And this identity is what consciousness creates. But consciousness in itself cannot exist. It must exist as consciousness of something. Something has to project it. And it has to reflect in other things. So it's a derivative. You can say, I am a consciousness having experience. No, you are not. You are you, and you have consciousness. This is very important. This is not nitpicking. And somebody who says he's a pure consciousness, he's talking nonsense. And I only hope he doesn't really believe what he says, because this means that he said that he's in fact nothing that persists in the illusion that it exists. A bit convoluted, I know, but this is very difficult. In philosophical terms, this can get very thorny to explain, but it has philosophical roots, it has scientific roots, historical roots. Modern philosophy is built on this idea. You have it, for instance, in Descartes, cogito ergo sum, where he tries to find certainty in knowledge and finds it in his reflection. I can doubt everything except me who am doubting, although people forget what he says next. But he says, I'm finite. So how is this certain when I die? It's certain because God created me. So people don't take, eject this part of Descartes' argument, but it exists. So that's more or less a summing up of modern philosophy of consciousness. And David Icke is very well embedded in it, and people who think in this way, post-humanists especially, they are masterful at this.
Yeah, that was kind of the area I wanted to cover. So maybe Mihai, you have another angle on things.
Well, it is a little bit difficult because Branko talked about many things for the past about 10 minutes. He passed from St. John of the Cross to consciousness, ego, Western philosophy, and David Icke again. So the circle is closing with David Icke. So I'm not going to add anything about this discussion of dark night of the soul. In Orthodoxy, we don't have this term, but many of the fathers describe something similar. If you have heard of Saint Silouan the Atonite, I don't know, Branko, if you heard of him. He was canonized in the 20th century. He lived in the 20th century. He died in the 20th century, actually, 1938. His disciple wrote his life. This is what he experienced for about 15 years, being left by the Spirit, or apparently being left. And he described this in very vivid detail. He received a revelation from Christ directly. He told him, keep your mind in hell and don't despair. So this is something very deep, which I'm not going to talk about because I don't understand fully. I'm far from understanding fully what is meant by this, and I don't think anyone can understand it in totality except for those who have actually lived those states. What I'm going to say is, let's say, of a more practical concern about what Branko said about the ego. So, of course, from a philosophical perspective, from a philosophical discourse, it can appear to be something extremely abstract, like seeing yourself in the mirror. But there are some extremely practical, day-to-day concerns, which I think everybody can see in daily life if he is serious about asceticism and leading a truly spiritual life. So that the ego is like a story we tell about ourselves. If you want, it is a constant historical revisionism of ourselves, because our image of ourselves, of how we understand ourselves, is changing with every passing mood. Right now, I'm in the grips of sort of prideful passion, and I see myself this great individual who achieves I don't know what. Then I'm in the grips of mild depression. I see myself as nothing. We like to label ourselves, to construct this artificial identity about ourselves. I am this. I am a guy who listens to this sort of music, who likes this sort of stuff, and who has this outlook on life. So we construct such an artificial identity, we construct a box for ourselves, and then we attempt to fit ourselves in that box, in that tiny box that can never contain ourselves, because that is just an idol, actually. That That is what we're engaging in self-idolatry. So the idea is that at the risk of something of sounding a bit like David Icke in that interview, we are much more than we can express in words and in labels and in all these narrow definitions. You know, there is, let's say, an apophatism of men, like there is an apophatism of God. So we cannot never really describe another, or we can never exhaust not our own person and not another person in words or in definitions. So what is of very great importance in this thing is to always, let's say, move beyond what you think you are, what you think about yourself at every single moment. You need to have this, let's say, negative theology towards yourself of not being content to say, okay, I am, so I will limit myself only to what is the definition. That is a sure way of doing an extreme amount of damage to yourself, because you are identifying with an idol, and of course that is not good, and God will have to take the hammer and break that idol. So if you don't want to break it yourself, you might have to pass through rather unpleasant experiences, which are for the good, but which can lead you in a very dark place for a while, and it can be quite painful. I can speak also of, from a limited perspective, from a limited experience of mine. But this is the thing: we tend to identify with whatever definition we concoct about who we are and about the things around us, and then we don't want to move beyond it. We take this image, this illusion, and we grab it and do not want to let go of it. And this is extremely damaging, extremely harmful.
I'm going to tell a small little story that is maybe has some horrible interpretation. But for a very long time, I went through a very, very bad, about 13 years of extreme anxiety and depression. And one of the experiences that I used to experience towards the end of it, when I was so exhausted, because it was every day, all the time, every day. I spent 6 months without leaving my bed. I spent 5 years without leaving my house. But one of the experiences that used to happen was I would wake up in the morning time and I would have no idea what I was. And I used to have to spend about 15 minutes putting together the story of what I was. So I used to have to work out, am I animate or inanimate? Am I animal or human? Am I male or female? Am I child or adult? I had to construct an idea of who I was, and it was an extraordinarily disorientating experience. But because of all the other experiences I'd had over the years, it stopped frightening me. I just wasn't. I had gone past being afraid. But it was actually an experience of absolute disintegration of any idea of who we are, you know. So in a way, what it makes me realize is these ideas that we have of I am this or I am that are so vulnerable. They can be just whipped away from us in any moment. In any moment, everything to do with our appearance, our job, our skills, our abilities, our history. Well, maybe not so much your history, but your relationships can just be eliminated.
They are very fragile, these images that we project about ourselves, and because they are images. Like I said, we are inexpressible, so we cannot exhaust ourselves in words and definitions. And one of the things, you know, people do when, let's say, their comfortable storytelling comes to an abrupt end and everything starts disintegrating, is the attempt to hold everything together artificially, you know, to get back, you know, to that artificial state and do whatever possible to recreate that feel. But it is not something, you find out very quickly, it is not something you can do at will. So things will continue to disintegrate without you being able to do anything. And I think these are actually good experiences, because you are forced to get out of the comfortable place you have created for yourself, comfortable but artificial, and to get back to the real fundamental questions, to find out what exactly is really new and what is just an image, a mask you are trying to show to the world. Because when we look in ourselves in every area of life, and also perhaps especially in our religious and spiritual lives, we can see, let's say, different strata, different levels of like an onion, with different peels. We can never truly say that there is just one intention about what we do and what we believe. And if we are honest with ourselves, we will also see other mundane and ulterior motives for the things we hold dear. So the question comes, and always comes to this question: is there, at least a grain of mustard of faith, or of the real thing in us? And of course, it is not accidentally that I'm using this image of the grain of mustard. It is very related to the Gospels, and also it is related to this idea of unity. This unity, this let's say very small thing, very small grain, but which let's say informs our whole being. On the lower we get in our lives, or at the lower levels of our psyche and so on, it gets distorted by all sorts of ulterior motives about which I talked about, let's say social status, or I don't know, the need to appear interesting to your friends or to those around you. But the questions, in these periods of crisis is always this: is there really this grain, this small unity from which I can be reborn after the illusions are being thrown away? I don't know if I was entirely coherent in what I talked.
Yeah, I think so.
You're not convinced?
It's just a very difficult area, isn't it?
Yes, it is very difficult.
You put just enough meat on the bones of this abstract philosophical narration I gave. So believe me, it's for the benefit of the listeners.
I always, when I talk about these things, I always have in mind, some deep psychology in Dostoevsky. The fact that you can never pinpoint your exact intentions, or you can rarely pinpoint it. You can rarely say that you have 100% mapped your own intentions. There is always an unintelligible residue. You don't really know what it is about when you decide something, or when you do something.
Yes. Yeah, but this is what we. You have this idea of unconscious in psychoanalysis. They made science of this thing, the Mihai said, which is in fact pretty everyday experience of anybody who has any depth in him. And it was always like that. This is not a new thing. I mean, what I really want. Is this what I really want? For instance, people can go through life carried by a whole lot of lofty aims, and to realize in the end that they never wanted it. They wanted something opposite, and they genuinely were not able to see this. So I think this is what gives life depth. And this idea of this consciousness idea, like New Age, truth vibrations, kind of like completely neglects it. They completely put this in the shadows. They reject it. They don't take it into consideration. They cannot really relate to real people. And I'm impressed that there are some people who genuinely believe that, because if they would really reflect into themselves, they would know that, idea that I make my own reality is pretty stupid, provided that I really don't know who I am. I'm not so certain that I am this, that all those things I want and incline in life are really authentic.
Something now that is probably what's the word? I'm always afraid to say something that reveals some demonic side to me. Oh God, that's bad. We were talking about ego identity and identification, and then the pulling away of all the idols of the self that is either caused externally, that we either work on ourselves or is removed from us. But one of the things that I have found over my life is that it's this feeling that it doesn't matter what we do, you know. It's really hard to have ambition because it seems to be that whenever I see people who become, say, like a famous doctor or a famous engineer or a famous scientist or some sort of great achiever, they become very identified with that, incredibly enmeshed in this identity, which creates an even stronger illusion. And I just find it really hard to kind of think, oh, it's worth becoming X, Y, or Z, because it doesn't seem worth it to me.
This lack of ambition one can feel, and I can relate 100%. The idea that you don't know why you would choose some kind of high aim in life to realize yourself, quote unquote. Now, we said that there is a deep reason why this can be meaningless, but there is also a more mundane way. The world has changed, and what I mean is that a lot of things that were, let's say, praiseworthy career choices or vocation choices when I was a kid do not exist anymore. For instance, if I was to work in a Western country as a high school teacher, I would have a huge problem, not only because of the whole gamut of ideological nonsense I would have to put up with, far less than I would have to in communism, mind you, but because the very profession seemed to have dissolved. It is having a completely different purpose. So, to take philosophy, for example, philosophy that you study in universities today, in most cases has very little to do with philosophy. For instance, in communist times in Yugoslavia, where Marxism was understood as a kind of gospel, you had better access to traditional understanding of philosophy than you have now, in my opinion. Although there are, of course, always venues where you can learn the right thing. In Marxism, of course, any freedom you have is an accident. But there were a lot of those accidents in Marxism, which means that the system was not as tough as the system we have today, in my opinion, in European Union. My opinion is that the ruling ideology of European Union is a far more, I shudder to say coercive, but let's say far more effectively coercive than communism was. Because it really seems to change hearts and minds in certain parts of Europe, where Mihai and I live, not so much maybe, for various reasons, none of them being intelligence of our people and character, but mostly inertia and the happy accident that we are always on the tail end of everything. Croats even more than Romanians, we being smaller country and not on Black Sea and having less strategic importance. Less strategic importance just now. But I think this is also a thing. I started from this, what you were talking about, this choice of vocation in life, of aims of life. The trouble is, how many choices do you have now? If you there was a choice, and it's still here, but it is under threat. For instance, to get married. But I don't think that marriage that has is such a desirable, praiseworthy thing anymore. I mean, this is a long process, but now we are coming to its kind of like culmination, where you have 100 types of marriage. For instance, you have I won't give other instances, as not to go into tried area of certain kind of marriages we already talked about, and it's already getting boring. But
which are not marriage actually.
Yeah, we agree on that so many times that it's really getting boring.
Well, actually, I'll give a more concrete example, or no, shall we say a less contentious example. I had a law degree, and yet when I had my first child at 22, I chose to be a stay-at-home mother, and I spent the next 25 years at home with my family, and that is not a choice that has very much validity anymore, and it wasn't even recognized as an adequate career or choice, shall we say, by the ordinary general society. Now it's considered now. In fact, actually, I was having this conversation earlier this morning. We were talking about the fact that there's a lot of bullying going on online from young people, and one of the reasons I suggested is that perhaps a lot of children who live nowadays have been socialized via the, I think, collectivism of day centers from infancy. And I remember when this started to happen about 20 years ago, when there was this push on to start putting children into daycare, and for the women to go out to work, which is a very communist way of thinking.
Right, that one.
What I'm actually saying is that then over the last 20 years, then that choice to be at home with your children became less and less meritorious, less and less anything that you could, feel proud of. I'm not saying I did feel very proud of it, but what I'm actually saying is that the idea of some sort of progressive collectivist raising of the children of the community so that both parents could work became much more desirable. I agree totally with what you were saying, that this one of the reasons why it's hard to have ambition is that the choices are not really valid.
Yes.
Well, here I would enter and say a little that the validity of a choice, let's say, it shouldn't be determined but by what the general society thinks of it. I mean, it can be that at certain times society thinks something valid about a thing, but that is just accidental. So the essential thing is the thing in itself. So is marriage good? Is raising children good? These are the questions that should be asked, not what some pre-adolescents say on YouTube about these issues.
But
because I don't think they have much credibility.
Even adult people and people in their 30s and 40s, I've heard them saying things like, oh, wasn't it well for you to be able to stay at home and do nothing, etc. like this, this idea.
I think people have a very distorted image, just like about this staying at home and raising children, just like they have a distorted image about being a monk. So they think that you do nothing all day and you just relax, you have no worries, you sleep when you want, you do whatever you want, but that is not real. And I mean, I have the experience of a previous generation. I live quite a bit to see. My great-grandmother lived till I was about 12. In Romania, traditional life was something ordinary, day-to-day experience, and it wasn't like those people there, in their daily chores they did, raising children, looking after the household, and it is not like these are unworthy or small things. I mean, you are raising a human being to be a human being. You are raising a person.
I think it goes further than that, Mihai, because if you buy into the idea, well, actually, it's not even buying into the idea. The way society is structured at the moment, two people have to work in order to afford a house. When I was growing up,
that's a problem.
One person, my father worked, my mother stayed at home because it was possible to afford a house. Now it's not. I mean, there are some questions you have to ask. Well, the cost of childcare is so high. Does it really make that much of a difference? I don't know. That's another thing. But when I look out into the society the way it is now, with people in traffic jams from 6:30 in the morning until 8 o'clock, they leave their children in the crash at 6:30 in the morning, they pick them up again at 7:30 at night time. This has got to affect the whole structure of the society, and this is an environment, a way of living, a civilization that has been encouraged by, I don't know what.
Yes, and you know the problem. You know the greatest problem we face nowadays. So you have these jobs, that take pretty much the whole of your day. You leave your house at 8 o'clock in the morning, let's say, you finish work at about 5:30, 6 sometimes. This in the happy situation when you are not doing overtime, but this is something other. So you get home after about 10 to 11 hours of being away. So what happens, first of all, you are not only you don't have time, so your whole day is occupied by these jobs, but also your energy. These things are very stressful nowadays. The jobs are a lot more agitated, stressful, and so on. So you are also drained of energy. So what do you do then? You sacrifice exactly those very important areas of life that make a life worth living. So you say, okay, I need to have time for myself. So first of all, I need to take care of my personal interests. And you neglect, you neglect friends, you neglect family members. You don't meet with people so much. You don't communicate. You go out of the state of communion, and you buy into this, let's say, individualized personal interest stuff. Of course, there is nothing wrong to also, you need to have what interests you in life, your personal studies, I don't know, but in the long run, being deprived of communion with people, of communications, of getting around with friends and family and so on, this impoverishes the soul. It impoverishes your life, and it makes you less human. Perhaps it is a bit harsh term to say, a harsh thing to say, but this is what actually happens, and you see this in big cities. You have this feeling like you walk through crowded places of atoms. Everybody is an atom. Nobody wants to have anything to do with any other, and it is pretty depressing when you see such things. You give people give their kids, let's say, a smartphone or a tablet. Hey, here, entertain yourself while I'm watching TV, or I'm dropping out and descending into a vegetative state because I'm too tired after work, or something like this.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, and this is the problem with this. You started talking, Deirdre, about this childcare and so on. It's all very systematized. What I noticed in Ireland, for instance, is this high dependency on state, on behalf of people, on government, on social care, on such things, and very low dependency and feeble ties with family. And I think there is a correlation, because this, what they call welfare state, it's a broad term, but let's say this type of welfare state, as you have, at least in idea, in European Union, as a project, what they called flex security, as if you can work flexibly, changing jobs and be secure, which does not jive well one with another. I think that it is directly severing ties that are primary, the tie with your family. Also,
sorry, Branko, I think there is another illusion. I see pretty much in the newer generations, when they have kids, they trust some random article on the internet more than they trust family members on advice of how to raise a child. No, I mean, they had parents, and they ended up pretty well. I mean, the kids, they themselves, who are now raising their own children. So, to any sensible person, it would make much more sense to ask your parents for advice, for example, or your grandparents, or people around you, family members, and so on, than to trust some random source on YouTube or some random thing you read on the internet and experiment with your children as if they are some kind of lab rat to all sorts of experiences on. Let's try this.
I think some of it has maybe people have lost confidence in themselves and they turn to what they think is the scientific measure of truth.
Yeah, among other things.
Hmm.
But what impresses me is how people concede with all this. Okay, this aspect you were just talking about is something that none of us can change. It is not something that I would say was implemented consciously, like somebody intentionally created economy to be such and such. Although there are aspects of it when we talk about these supranational institutions, because they work according to plans from the committees, as commies did. That really is the case, but those plans often fall flat.
You don't think that there was a plan to get both people out working, to make, to actually lower the wages of everybody, so that, to say, oh, women can earn as much as men, but actually what they did was they brought down everybody's wages.
I wouldn't flat out deny it. I would say that these things I don't think in practice really work so effectively. I think that if we are talking about European Union, we are talking about a supranational institution that is entirely built on planning. It's a fact. Same like United Nations. But I don't think this kind of social engineering, I don't think it can really work in the long run. It has to show cracks. So there is an aspect of this modern life in general, modern mentality, let's say, that is being accustomed to this and that is kind of like demanding, in a way, such life. What I'm trying to say is when we verged in this area of conspiratorial politics, to use a tried term, people tend to forget that they are accomplices themselves. There are two in this relationship, and I think people are very well attuned to it. Not everybody to a same extent, not every nation to a same extent. And the European Union, what is interesting in European Union is that there is no balance, not only between Western and Eastern Europe, because in Eastern Europe, I sometimes use this blanket term, which is not very good, because it is so diverse space that you cannot really put it all under one umbrella. But it has this tendency to resist this, for instance, and they don't resist some things. For instance, nobody resists making a lot of money. Everybody loves that, and one of the reasons why you have overworked population is because, among other things, they dreamed about this in late stages of communism, to have everything those Westerners have. Only they forgot this aspect that there is a cost to this. And this is quite normal. This is what I call post-communist syndrome. Russia was a great example of that because Russia was in chaos in the 90s. But most of our countries were. So what I want to say is that people are partly culprits in this. And but what I find the most fascinating is people buying into ideology. For instance, believing in these civil religions like that if they don't recycle and separate their trash from their home, that they are doing some kind of sacrilegious act. I had to go a bit west to see that some people really believe in this. I was fascinated because one one thing that differentiates this from communism is in communism, you are obliged not to believe. In Yugoslavia, Slavoj Žižek talked about this, and he was right. He said in Yugoslavia, especially in the 80s, if they noticed somebody that really believes in socialist self-management, they would say, party people, oh, we got to watch this guy, he could be...
Sorry, in socialist self-management?
Yeah, that was the economic system of Yugoslavia was called like that. Socijalističko samoupravljanje. That was an economic system they cooked up in hope that they can keep country together when Tito, the ruler, dies, because they knew when he dies everything will fall apart. And if they noticed somebody that really believes in this, they would say, this guy could be trouble. He really believes this crap. So in communism, communism had this aspect of irony, because all those lofty phrases, not always. And you are talking, okay, I'm talking about Yugoslavia here. It was, Yugoslavia was a rather unique communist state. It was far more lenient, but it ended up in blood. It ended up worse than Russia to some extent, because Russia had this dissolution of Soviet state, and there were, except Chechen war in the 90s, there were no wars, while Yugoslavia ended up in the mire of blood. But that's another thing. But in communism, you have always this discrepancy between ruling ideology and what people believe. Nobody really bought into it. Very, very small numbers of people, especially in these later stages, 70s, 80s, and so on. Whereas in European Union, you have this. And what I find fascinating is there is no visible coercion.
Yeah, but maybe propaganda is so much better now, so much more advanced. Maybe the visual medium that we were talking about, where you can get a hold of people's imagination and fantasy and their whole unconscious, is much easier now.
Deirdre, what I notice is that even people who, let's say, don't care too much, don't engage so much in the public domain, in current contemporary politics and so on, it is almost as if they believe these things by default. Mm. So they start from these presuppositions, actually. Mm. I told Branko, I just read a book, a very interesting book. I don't know if you remember the character Ryszard Legutko, the Polish guy whom I cited in one of my articles. You read that book too?
Yes, I did.
Yes, a very good book. And he said somewhere, in one of the chapters, the book is called The Demon in Democracy. So he said something to the extent that in no period of history you can say that the people fit the regime so much as they do in this liberal democracy, that the EU is promoting. So I think that people are also asking for this, or they find it natural. I mean, this is what I told Branko in a private conversation, that this liberalism, this liberal democracy is more fully identified with the spirit of these times in which we are living. So this is why people accept it almost as a natural or a self-evident thing. This is my opinion. Communism was also a result of modernity, could say the apex of modernity. I mean, of the Enlightenment thinking. But it ended up not. I don't know how to put it. It didn't, let's say, live up completely to the spirit of the times, or perhaps I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly. Perhaps it's the means it employed weren't adequate to.
They weren't subtle enough. Maybe.
Yes. This.
Not only that, because in communism you have a funny thing with communism. I mean, it ended up conserving, let's say, modes of life that were pre-modern even. Although declaratively they wanted to eradicate everything. So you had, for instance, in Romania, you had Ceausescu and his his lovely wife Elena, who were, I don't know about Elena, but Ceausescu was a Romanian peasant, and he was a man who came from that background. In Yugoslavia, you had Tito. Tito was from Zagorje, this northern part of Croatia, also peasant guy and bon vivant. He was, he liked a good living, and it was very important for him. And those people ended up, in the end, as some sort of kings. Those countries, I'm not sure about Romania, but Yugoslavia was, one could even say, something like a kingdom, because once he died and he made no effort to provide not only successor, but to provide any kind of running that country without him, it fell apart after 10 years. So they practically reinvented pre-modern, a travesty of pre-modern societies in structure. For instance, in Yugoslavia, you had this in all communist countries, the hierarchy of party and army and working people. Now these three parties,
I think I just found what I was looking for a bit earlier. Now I think communism was much more of an image of an inverted religion. And this is, I mean, it required this, let's say, religious adherence almost, this almost pseudo-spiritual adherence to its principle. While in today's system, in today's postmodernity, I think this current system today thrives more on indifference. Indifference, I mean, of course, not to its ideological dictates. You cannot be indifferent of whether you have gay marriages or not. You must have gay marriages because blah, blah, blah. But it relies on indifference of anything higher than, mundane, the most banal aspect of mundane life. This is what I think the current system strives upon. Total indifference. Religion is just something you do in private. Who cares? Who cares about your national identity or your history? Who cares about this? Who cares about that? What's important is to have a good time. So I think this is the mentality this lukewarm mentality is what you see mostly these days. And I think this is what this system thrives upon. Communism was really built as like some sort of ersatz religion. I think Marx says something to that extent, that communism was supposed to, or socialism to replace, this religious need of people, with not with fantasies of an afterlife, but with something realistic, so to speak.
Yes. I would say that you pinpointed the right word. It's indifference. This is built. I think indifference is a central word for everything here, because all those reforms that ended up warping societies from, let's say, our standpoint, came about on indifference, because Because they were not forced upon. The only requirement was not caring about them. So I don't give a damn. Not only that, but not to care inside. I mean, because not to interfere. That's still communist things. They would tolerate you after sometimes when they realize that they cannot control hearts and minds. But this is. I would say this is not so much coercion as as much as it is a kind of deal that was made in silence between people and those who rule them. Just think of yourself and live and let live. And this ended up in indifference, which is the worst kind of hate, because it makes everything the same. And only now, when some of those social reforms become so atrocious and so obviously crazy, people are beginning to react. And a good deal of them, especially younger people and people more to the west, let's say in Europe, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to react because somewhere along the way, they cut their own roots.
I actually think that idea of a stable foundation, or not knowing instinctively what to revert to, is an important point, because it's something that I observe in local social media. Whenever I'm discussing with people, I find that I'm struggling for words to describe what I think is self-evident or ought to be self-evident to people. But it doesn't appear to be self-evident to the younger people that I'm speaking to. And it's very difficult to find words to describe why something is wrong or should not be tolerated. It's very difficult to find words to describe what is obvious. I'm going to give you an example, a more concrete example. Recently, I noticed that there is this thing in Ireland called the National Curriculum. The people who develop the curriculum for the schools, this is an official body at the state level. And one of the things that they have recently been charged with at the end of 2018 was to investigate how we can further develop or evolve sex education for children in schools. Okay? So this committee, which... the communist thing always strikes me. There's always committees, there's always paperwork, there's always these dignitaries. Yes.
Pass on decrees.
Exactly. There's always these worthy dignitaries and people who are considered experts. And so anyway, recently they had this commission of investigation to see how they can improve sex education for children. And what they did was they referred to a document that was written in 2010 by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they described this as the most appealing, most justifiable route to take, that Irish people should adopt, or the Irish government should adopt the strategy of this WHO document. And this WHO document outlines what they call a matrix, and the matrix tells what you should tell children between 0 and 4, 4 and 6, 6 and 9, 9 and 12, etc. onwards. And if you read the matrix that this WHO came up with, it's extremely invasive of what they are planning to, what they think children should learn. Before the age of 4, they should be being talked to about their own exploration of their own body and masturbation, and then by the time they're between 4 and 6, they can be taught about gender identities, and then by the age of 9 you can be talking to them about their first sexual experiences. Now, if you actually said to somebody at the moment in Ireland, say a younger generation person than me, this is not right, this is wrong, they immediately presume that you're some sort of a backward person. They don't seem to be able to go back to a ground,
the bare bones of the matter.
The bare bones of the matter.
And these are just to give an example of what you said in that recyclable toilet paper document from the WHO. So there are many cases, of impotence at a young age. This is becoming more and more of an incident nowadays. So you can start from there, and you can realize exactly how healthy these practices are.
I don't understand what you mean.
I mean, for example, this is a thing I actually followed some studies. The fact that and this has been going on for a while, the fact that they recommend masturbation from a very young age. This practice on such an enormous scale from an extremely young age will cause impotence later on. I mean, without saying anything about, let's say, the degree of stimulation, the degree of excitement these kids are subjected to nowadays. They cannot relate anymore to what is normal. So this is why you have so many deviations, like I don't know how many gender identities, I don't know how many perversions, which people are saying should be considered normal, because the normalcy is not so stimulating anymore, because they are subjected to this bombardment of excitory. So, and these are the bare bones, because I want to go back to what you were saying. These are the bare bones of the matter that people are purely and simply ignoring. And I think they will continue to ignore them until the consequences are so obvious that they cannot be ignored anymore.
Yeah, but I actually don't think that I mean, maybe this is very depressive, but I don't think that there's a point where people will say, whoa, hang on a minute, we're going too far here, because we've actually gone too far already. So yes, there is no place that we can actually turn back, because we'd actually have to start slapping people on the way back. We'd actually have to start stomping on people to go back. So we actually can't go back. I mean, I just don't think, but one of the points is that if you have children from the age of 0, which they do in collective daycare, all the way up to 16, you can completely control what the new population is like. It doesn't matter what the family wants to teach the child, because they already have heard some sort of mandated version of what's the truth elsewhere.
Yeah, and it is done in such a way that you kind of wonder, if you remember previous times, you kind of wonder when did this happen? Because it's easier for somebody, I shouldn't to call myself older generation. I'm not that old, but I do remember time before 1991. It was, or 1990, that was this year of great realignment in geopolitical sense and all these changes, when this kind of like came to the fore in force. So let's say at one point in my life, I started remembering myself. I know where I'm coming from. And so it can beat these things, can bruise me, but cannot uproot me. But for younger people, yeah, it's more difficult, especially in the West. Now I'm in my country, there is a great opposition to this, and there is great opposition among the young.
I don't understand why there isn't an opposition here. What happens is the opposition are groups like, say, Renua, which is a very minor political movement that is very strongly allied to very religious people. And so therefore, because religion is so hated, I mean despised, they are completely dismissed. Now, I have to say that these people don't make themselves, they go out of their way to make themselves unattractive, because they can be quite dogmatic and unpleasant in some ways, and maybe use the same techniques as the extremists on the other side, So it's very hard to feel or to be in an alliance with people that are fundamentalist in their own way.
Well, for Romania, the acceleration happened clearly somewhere between 2007, when we entered the European Union, and 2012, let's say. These were the years of fundamental changes in Romanian society. and these have been greatly accelerated the past 4 years. Now this growing wave of secularization, of let's say of westernization.
It's very country specific. Ireland, for instance, is a very unique case, and I would need to have a lot of time working and living in Ireland to even begin to understand, because there are a lot of underlying causes in Irish people, I think, in some traumas from the past, and so it's not a straightforward thing, and it's multi-layered and not easy to understand. I think Ireland is really specific in this case because it really happened so quick and in so radical way, especially when you're looking at it from my standpoint, which is now that's worlds apart. But that shows you how this European Union is uneven. And the thing is, you have to buy people with something. We live in these, how would I call it, Central to Eastern European states. They are not buying us with anything. We are not significant, I don't know, for in some way that they would give you something, and then you would trade your own self for that something. You would sell yourself. They are not buying, and this is good.
Well, I'll tell you, Croatia is a bit different. Croatia is a bit different because, like you said, it also geopolitically and also as a smaller population, you have this greater survival instinct, more acute survival instinct. Romania is really starting to go downhill in a pretty rapid manner because, like I said, the European Union has a big interest here because, like we are on the eastern border of the European Union. And of course, being on the eastern border means being close to Russia, to Turkey, and to other such actors. So the European Union has a big interest here, and they really invested more in propaganda in our countries than perhaps in Croatia. But also, I think also the people, because there have been, of course, changes for the good in the social life, meaning changes for the good, meaning precisely material questions. A higher income, a higher standard of living, especially in big cities. So people are starting to feel, let's say, to have a taste of the so-called good life. And when they have a taste, even if a small taste, because it is not a big taste. This good life comes with other more not so good things, like families which are in disarray and stressed out people, overworked and so on. But they get this taste of the good life and they want more. They want to go where there is more to get. So slowly but surely it is my sense at least that we're going on this downhill trend, and it gets sort of depressing for me many times when I shudder to think where it will end, because even among acquaintances of mine, I know people personally who have completely cut roots. Some of them moved westwards, and they completely cut their own roots, with their native place, with their heritage. They went all the way full-blown progressive. It is really depressing for me because I can see, living in the very capital, at the very center of things, I can see significant differences from what things used to be a few years ago. For example, it is getting more and more unusual spectacle to see the younger generations take no interest in the traditional feasts like Christmas or Easter, and not only from the religious point of view, but even in the customs, in the secondary customs which are associated with these feasts. In Bucharest, you have people who on Christmas they eat pizza at the mall because It's mostly people who have come from the rural areas and they work here and they don't have time to prepare anything, and purely and simply they moved into indifference, towards these things. So yes, it is a bit different from what Branco, I think, is experiencing on the coast of Dalmatia.
I have to say, though, I remember when the stories came out here in the media about the orphanages in Romania, I remember thinking at the time that there was a great parallel between those orphanages and the Magdalen laundries and the industrial schools and the mother and baby homes here in Ireland. So I just wonder if there is an aspect of shared or similar trauma underlying the psyche of the people that enables a quicker, faster break from the past or tradition.
There might be something like this, yes. There might be, although of course I would have to go a little bit deeper, especially in the modern history of Romania, because there are some antecedents in this sort of things, but I won't go into this now. Something similar has happened in Russia also. In the Russia of 19th century, for example, the Russia which is described in novels such as The Demons, or The Possessed, how it's translated in English, by Dostoevsky. One aspect which I can point to is a certain break between in the intellectual strata of society. The intellectuals themselves are, let's say, the first traitors, some of them at least. They are the first to break it with local tradition, to break it with the church, and to move towards this progressive stance. It is also a sort of snobbery, I think, on their part. But what has happened is a break between the intellectuals and the tradition, for one thing, and also between the intellectuals and the rest of society. Let's say the people. So these people have always showed a certain contempt towards the common man, especially living in the rural areas, and the people themselves have been bereft of models, of role models to relate to.
Well, actually, the same happened, now that you mention it, the same happened in Ireland, in the sense that great intellectuals like James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, they all moved away from here, moved to Europe, and decided that Ireland was just far too backward, and they broke all connection with the church, and they despised the roots in many ways, and they were the great artistic or intellectual forces of their era, and it is possible that would have had an influence.
Excuse me, it's just to interject about Joyce. It's a tragic thing with him, because when you take Ulysses, this is the novel of the Odyssey of modern man, and from all the capitals of Europe and USA, he picked up Dublin, which was at that time a small city at the outskirts of Europe, and yet he placed his epic exactly there, where he, as he said, couldn't breathe. It was suffocating. And this tells you something, that's why I like him. I kind of like that kind of people that have to live in such discrepancy, because he probably had two hearts in his breast. But for instance, in somebody like Joyce, he's replete with this Catholic spirit, but he not really secularizes it, but it's kind of like an impetus you feel in his writing. That goes also, for instance, for Joseph Conrad, great Polish English writer. So I think there is more than meets the eye in people like Joyce, and I don't know about Beckett. That's already a different story. But it's really a tragic thing, and I think that Joyce really had no reason for resentment. He was educated by Jesuits, as far as I know, and was very well liked by Jesuits. Yeah, I always thought that he suffered something at the hands of his teachers, but so he rebelled.
I think there was was there not some disgrace that was visited upon his father, or his father lost his job or something, and this was some great disgrace? But what he uses is the language of the church, but he actually uses it to describe secular experience, so he uses all the metaphors, but he removes them completely, from the religion, and brings them completely wholly into the most carnal of life.
Yeah, but he does it. I don't know. I'm talking about. Well, we are talking about a novel that cannot be rationalized, so I won't be rational about it. My sense was different. I know what you're talking about, but that's not only Joyce. The whole modernity, the literature of modernity, is built upon taking these ancient or medieval notions and putting them in the modern context. And there is always kind of comedy in it, irony, and Joyce is supremely ironic.
I could point the same thing to a guy like Umberto Eco. When you read a book like the Name of the Rose,
but that's a different thing.
You can see that he's completely fascinated by medieval civilizations, about the life in a medieval monastery and so on. But he cannot bring himself to accept the premises or the principle from which this life with which he is fascinated emanates.
That's. But you have different thing with Eco. This is already, I think, something different, because James Joyce is a medieval man.
I haven't read Joyce. I don't know.
You don't have to. I mean, you can take T.S. Eliot, for instance. I'm thinking about those writers that are called fathers of modernity, or.
But one thing that's important is that all of their educations were classical. They were rooted in Latin and the history and the geography and the English and they actually almost had a philosophical education. So how could they not but use the great wealth of a classic education? Whereas after that generation, really the education system just became much lower standard. It became a much lower standard.
Yeah. Although what I wanted to say is that they tried. They were all, most of them at least, those who I'm talking about from the first half of 20th century. What they wanted, I think, was resurrecting the substance of religion and myth in the modern context. They didn't reject it. They rejected the actual traditions that still existed. But they had this yearning for it. I don't think I would disagree with Mihai that there is something like that in Eco. Maybe it's my impression. Eco is very prone to counterfeit historical record in some, not in his novels, but in his semiological work. For instance, in historical work, he tried, for instance, to portray Abbe Baruel as an anti-Semite, this old conspiracy theorist, whereas this is not true.
He wrote something about Guénon too, which is completely off mark.
Yeah, and you have to know, Mihai, that he knows, he does it consciously, he knows what he's doing. He was too well educated not to know these things.
Yes, I think I misunderstood what you wanted to say about Joyce, because I just wanted to point out that although he writes, let's say, a book like The Pendulum of Foucault, in which he uses all sorts of Kabbalistic and Masonic symbolism and so on. So on the one hand, he says, or he said during his life, that he wrote these books to ironize, to deride these notions, this metaphysical, symbolic stuff. But on the other hand, beneath this derision, I think there is unassumed fascination with this. So, he didn't like this stuff, or he derided this stuff, but at the same time, he was almost pissed off. He couldn't believe, or he couldn't get himself to believe in this. This is my impression.
Yeah, I think that people like Joyce or T.S. Eliot, who was even explicit about it, had belief in themselves still. Joseph Conrad, even later Hemingway and those people who were writers who came and poets after them. For instance, a lot of them, as to say the most famous one, Ezra Pound, ended up in fascism precisely, I think, for that reason, because they felt that there is a movement that could preserve antiquity in Ezra Pound's case. And it was, of course, a misfire and a mistake he harbored all his life because he was a stubborn man. And this is, I think, difference towards those people and those later generation like Icke. Although Icke, I think, I'm not expert on him, but, he was Italian socialist. Italian socialists and communists are not the same communists like our guys. They are more romantic. They had this notion of they had this experience of Mussolini's fascism and wanted to move away as far as they can from this, I think. So it's a pretty different thing. But that's how it seems to me, I mean. You would like, Joyce, try reading Ulysses, but you have to be in the right mood. My reading of Joyce was, I think, 3 months. It took me 3 months. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason took me 2 months. That's saying something. But when I finished the book, Ulysses, I just opened all around again and started reading it from the beginning. I was delighted by it, but if you ask me why, I couldn't tell. At the surface level, nothing makes sense, but it is so beautiful at times. There is something in it. I mean, it is, in my opinion, it is really a work of modern literary genius.
A fascinating person. I remember reading once that I think it was a famous psychoanalyst. I don't know whether it was Freud or Jung, who said that he had analyzed both Joyce and his daughter. His daughter had schizophrenia, and he said that his daughter was sinking in deep water, but that Joyce was purposefully diving. They were both in the same state, but one was purposefully doing it. He had a very tragic life, really, in many ways.
Yeah, but he was a great writer. I mean, that's modernity, but I think, for instance, now, not the great writer, but a writer surely worth looking into Michel Houellebecq, believe it or not.
Michel Houellebecq?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God,
Houellebecq.
that book I read, Atomized, I swear I have never been I think I remember that. I cannot remember the story, but I found him a really bizarre person.
He is kind of like the greatest writer of Europe now. He is a half-baked writer in terms of style, but he is a serious writer. He really has an itch that he cannot scratch. And this itch is, I think, the things that we are talking about the whole time. He's the only writer I know of from these popular writers who really pinpoints the existence of nihilism in this seemingly utopian European society. He's acutely aware of it, and he writes ugly things in very bad style about ugly problems, but at least he's doing it. I was surprised when I read it first time. I was kind of like condescending. I thought it was nothing good. And then I noticed it was not well written. It was not well polished book. I think Possibility of Island or Atomic Particles, one of those books. But I was impressed with I saw man behind the book, and this is very important for me. I am a writer myself, although I don't publish that much and still less in English. And I have a feeling of this of writing process when you write story or even novel. There are these degrees of excellence, and one of the primary degrees, for me at least, is the authenticity of man, that you can see that there is somebody in those lines.
You can see that there is some what?
There is someone. Because when I read some modern writers of today, I see no one.
I totally agree. He actually is one of the most powerful writers that I've ever read, that can give off the mood of his personality onto the page. That's for sure. But the problem is that his personality or the mood that he gives off is very repulsive.
Well, most writers tend to be like that. But yeah, he is like that. But what I wanted to say, he had a reason to write. His reason to write was not money, not fame, not anything. He has an itch that he cannot scratch.
You know that he lived for a long time in Ireland?
No, I didn't know that.
He did. He lived, I think, down in Cork. Yeah, so he has had the experience of living, I don't know, about 10 years at least in Ireland, I think. Yeah, so maybe that's what turned him into who he is.
No, you don't need Ireland for that.
France is more than enough, I think.
That's true. I've met some very dark French people.